It's right about 3 o'clock, and so we are going to get started in a minute or two here. So we just wanted to give you another reminder. You're currently muted, so we cannot hear you or any of this maybe background noise coming from your end of the line. If you'd like to join in the conversation with us at any time, please feel free to do so by using the chat box. You can use that chat box to communicate any audio troubles you're having, if you're not seeing our slides, or if you have any questions about the content we're sharing. If you have a question about some of that content, you can also use the raise your hand function in the participants panel. Go ahead and raise that hand, and we'll go ahead and unmute you so you can ask whatever question it is you've got there. All right, so without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Julie Dennis, who will get us started.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the 2018 Tweaks to Standards webinar. As Kelly mentioned, I'm Julie Dennis. I'm the manager of Standards and Accountability, and I'm joined with Kelly on our team here, as well as Laura Van Dusen, who's joining us from Denver, Colorado, and she'll be chatting with us later on in the webinar. So this is pertaining to independent and merged affiliates, but we do recognize that we might have some state offices on the webinar to support the independent affiliates and merged affiliates, and so I just want to welcome all of you to our webinar, and thank you for joining us. Quick reminders, we are recording this, and I will put this up on the NRC, the National Resource Center, for those who are not sure of the acronym, and we will email out the presentation as well as some supporting documents once we are completed with this webinar. So without further ado, let's get into our agenda. So we have kind of an overview of the annual process. Why do we do these tweaks? Then we're going to dive into the specifics of them, and they're divided into, of course, the business standards and student support standards. We have an impact section, and then we are going to be discussing the NRC resources where you can find more information and answer any questions that you have. So without further ado, we will get started.
Great. Have a hand raised. Do you want to take that before we dive into the process here?
Yes.
Yep. So Paula, we're going to go ahead and unmute you right now. Paula, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
So it looks like maybe some folks are having trouble hearing us, which might be the problem. If that's the case and you're not dialed in via the phone, I would recommend that you dial in via phone. We're in a large conference room, and I think that over the computer the sound just doesn't transfer as well. So that would be my recommendation. And Paula, if you if you want to unraise your hand if you did not have a question, or you can keep the hand raised, and we'll come back to the question when we stop for questions. All right. So again, I recommend if you're just accessing it via computer, call in. That would be my recommendation. So let's continue with TQS 2.0, the process. So I think that it's been really important for us on the Standards and Accountability team to discuss TQS as a process. And I know that we have really honed this in on our cohort from 2017, and hopefully with 2018 cohort as well. But, you know, throughout the process, you know, we are always learning, and we learn from a variety of sources. And so, first of all, this is what the process looks like. So we have these July 2015 student support standards were released. In January of 2016, business standards were released. We released our annual tweaks in March of 2017 for last year. And then, of course, right now you are here with January 2018. And it's important that, again, on this process, we're all learning. These standards, as you know, going from TQS 1.0 to 2.0 were quite rigorous. And so we're kind of, you know, as a team here at the national office, we're re-examining ways that really further the intent of the standard and not get bogged down necessarily by the language or the kind of nuances of the standard. And because this is a process, we really wanted to create a process for rolling out the tweaks. So in the past, with TQS 1.0, we weren't doing things on an annual basis. It was really ad hoc, and I think that was probably very confusing for affiliates. And so we have decided to do this annually as a way to create a process. That this is something that you can anticipate and expect every year from the Standards and Accountability team, that these will be tweaks to the standards, and they should not affect, necessarily intent, but should really create clarification and further understanding and hopefully further learning for you and your affiliates. So again, why these tweaks? So first of all, it's a commitment from the national office to you for the idea of continuous improvement and learning with the TQS standards and with the reaccreditation process. And to that end, we received a lot of feedback from the network. We received a lot of, just data and data points from Reaccreditation 2017. And, with everyone now being on CISDM 2.0, there was some feedback of just taking into account those different aspects and realizing that we needed to make some updates and some tweaks. And again, I just want to reiterate and put everyone's minds at ease that these changes are minor. They are just reducing requirements via indicators. Again, not changing the intent of the standard, but really honing in on what that intent is and not getting bogged down necessarily by confusing language. Removing some requirements, things that we know that you're already doing, and then again, clarifying the language. So I just want everyone to take a breath. I think that you'll see that hopefully these tweaks are just something that should be pretty acceptable and easy to digest. All right, so we're going to get right into the business standards. One thing that I wanted to do for the overview is just kind of give you the number of tweaks per category. So we clarified language in 12 standards. We removed content in 10 and added content in 2, and you'll see when we go to the slides, if you were to count them all up, there's actually 9 in removed content and 1 in added content, and that's because they both switch, and that's what the little note at the bottom is. It includes standards in which content was removed from one standard and added to another, so that's where the number differentiation comes. So let's move into the clarifications, and I think that we'll be spending a good amount of time on this, and what we're going to do is we're going to do the business standards first, and then we're going to break for questions. So if you have any questions on any of these next 3 slides, I just ask that you hold them until we take that first break. All right, so for clarifications, we can divide these up into a couple of categories. So the first big category is that we clarified that policies and procedures do not need to be outline documentation process. And you can see there that this applies to personnel policies, volunteer policies, and then our 3 verification procedure standards. So background check procedures, data verification procedures, and parent-guardian consent form verification procedures. And what does this mean? So basically it means that we require, for example, in personnel policies, that you show a receipt of your confidentiality signatures for your staff and other, for your personnel. We realized that we required a process that would explain how you went about getting those signatures, where in the end we were just wanting to confirm that signature existed, that your employee did read and sign the confidentiality document. So, so basically you do not need to create a policy when what you in fact are handing in demonstrates that you're following that policy. And I want to kind of acknowledge that perhaps some of you who have already been working on reaccreditation for 2018 with our 2018 cohort might have produced some documentation about the process, and that is okay. We hope that it's helpful for you. But what we really saw in reaccreditation 2017 was, again, this idea that most folks who handed in documentation were just handing in the documentation, which was correct, and not handing in the process, but the standard itself read as that you needed to hand in both the process and the documentation. So that's kind of examples of that first clarified, that policies, procedures do not need to outline documentation process. For the second thing, we reorganized some content. And you can note here that volunteer policies is in both of these categories, both Category 1 and Category 2, as well as some things with partner engagement policies, strategic plan, and staff and orientation and training. And then lastly, we made very standard-specific clarifications, and I will go over these one by one. So for the website, there was some confusion relayed on our team as well about what it meant to have an email address that was public-facing, and I know that we had kind of come out with some guidelines, and then basically we found through the reaccreditation 2017 process that just really wasn't it wasn't meeting the intent of the standards, the guidelines that we were given, so we decided to kind of change that. And so all we did was that we clarified that at least one staff member's specific contact information is required. So if you are the ED and you want your name only on the website and that's it, we would just require that your name and email address and contact information is somewhere on the website, so that if I am some random person in your county and I want to contact you, I have a real person to contact. So again, I think that there was just some clarity that we wanted to get around that. For board committees, which is Business Standard 2.6, we wanted to clarify that the functions can be overseen by a combination of committees. I think people and affiliates really got worried that, you know, maybe governance and finance had to be two separate committees, and that was separate from executive, and, you know, keeping a lot of committees going. And that's not really what we were trying to say. What we were trying to say is that you need to just be able to have a committee that deals with those functions, and whatever you want to call that committee is totally fine, but as long as it deals with these core functions that we've outlined, then you would be good to go. And then also that quarterly committee report outs must be from standing committees and any active ad hoc committees that met during that quarter. So if you only have I don't know, like a gala committee that only meets, you know, maybe during the 4 or 5 months right before that gala committee doesn't need to report out, you know, 6 or 8 months in advance of the gala when they're not meeting. They don't have anything to report out. But when they've met during those times right before the gala, they would then report out on what they were meeting about. So that's an example there. For 3.1 board policies, so 3.1 was a new standard moving from TQS 1.0 to 2.0, and we just noticed that some things that 3.1 requires were included in bylaws, but if they aren't included in your bylaws, then they need to be standalone documents. So we're just basically clarifying that the board policies can be standalone or part of other board documents. And lastly, screening procedures. We clarified that the screening process occurs pre-employment onboarding. So again, it was just getting clarity. A lot of affiliates, of course, do that, but it was just you know, making it as clear as possible, especially since it's screening procedures, which of course has a high risk when hiring folks who are going to be working with our students. So those are the clarifications. So we'll move on to removed content. One thing is that I know that you're probably seeing this huge list and you're like, I don't know my standards, where are they? And digging through. Do not worry. One of the follow-up documents that we will be emailing out in addition to the recording and of this webinar, as well as the webinar slides, is a summary document that basically lists out all of these. So these are where we removed content. You can see here it pertains to several standards. And I'm just going to pull out some examples. So for 2.8, insurance coverage, we no longer require cybersecurity insurance, which was a thing that was on the standards when they came out in January of 2016, and then last year we kind of pulled back on holding we did not require cyber security insurance for our cohort going through in 2017 reaccreditation. And so we are still keeping with that, and we realize that cybersecurity insurance is pretty expensive, and it's not really consistent enough to require it of the network. So instead, what we added, which we'll get to in the next slide, is an IT security policy and personnel policies that is meant to address IT security and help protect data security through policies and actions. And again, I will be mentioning that IT security policy momentarily, so you can ask if you have questions about that. I'll be hopefully addressing them, and then of course we will stop for questions. Another example here is 3.4 with financial management and accountability policies. We no longer require that the policies require board authorization of financial account signatories. This is something that's typically covered in bylaws anyway, in an overarching assignment of fiduciary responsibility, and it's also verified through the audit process. So basically we found it redundant and not necessary, and so because we do require an audit every year and of our affiliates every year, and so we removed that requirement. And then lastly, just some of the things here for where are you? Oh, for 4.2, for financial monitoring, let me access my cheat sheet. Yes, this was a commonly mixed one. So we realized that it wasn't clear how, if boards had to approve financial reports every quarter, if boards just had to see them, how do you prove that they've approved them? It was a little bit confusing, and so we actually removed that aspect of it and basically just said as long as they are included in the included with the board documents every quarter, then that's acceptable, and we don't need to see in the minutes that they've approved them. There's really nothing for them to approve. They're just reviewing the financial documents and have access to them. And then one other one that I will give as an example is 7.1 for communications. Again, we required that there was somebody there who was like the specific communications person on your staff, and we removed that requirement, and again just put that with the website saying that there needs to be at least one staff member whose email and contact information is public facing. So those are just kind of some of the examples of the removed standard specific content. Right, and so the added content, so this is the only addition, and again I mentioned it in the previous slide, we removed the cybersecurity aspect from insurance, and we put in these personnel policies and IT security policy. And so you're probably thinking, what does that mean? And why? So first of all, this was actually a request from the National Board through the board for our policies. And we will, did we just?
I don't know what happened.
Okay, we're just going to pause 1 minute. There it is.
The screen went blank. We're back.
Yes.
Sorry about that, folks.
Okay, great. So as I was saying, this was a request from our National Board for policies, and some examples, if you're wondering what does that mean, with an IT security policy. It might be some password security or protocols or technology about accessing security protocols. It could be data management and security, virus protection, policies that outline responses to breaches, things like that. And if you remember from my webinar series last year on personnel policies, because we really take personnel policies and give that ownership to the affiliate, it will be up to you to determine what IT security policy is best for your affiliate. However, I do want to let you know that we'll be revamping some of the guides on the NRC and putting some additional resources on the NRC, and I would also encourage you to reach out to the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. Again, you receive a free membership through using your CIS as CIS affiliate to nonprofit risk management, and they are a really great resource for lots of different documents, and they actually also have a policy creator. So if you're really stuck, you could reach out to them to help and have them help you craft the policy that's best for your affiliate. So more soon on the NRC from me. I do have it that we'll be kind of updating the guide to include some questions to consider for an IT policy, and then I'll also be doing my own outreach to nonprofit risk management, and I will be asking them for resources that then I will in turn transfer to you. So. All right. It seems like we might be frozen.
We might be frozen. That's fine. See what I can do.
Okay. We are going to. You might not be frozen now, are you?
Oh, it's gone.
Oh, that's so strange.
What just happened? My Outlook restarted. We might have lost folks. Hey, Laura, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, but I can't see you.
Okay. Looks like our WebEx just restarted on us, so we're going to just reboot it and bring us right on back. Sorry, just give us a moment.
It looks like it. Oh.
Probably you are probably the presenter.
So, where are you? Kelly Mears. Hello. Why didn't you pass the ball? I passed it.
I'm not on. That's a
Oh.
Yours.
That's a fake Kelly.
It's a lying Kelly Mears. All right, so we should be almost back, folks. Thanks for being patient with us. All right, sorry about that. Should be back entirely. Yep.
So now we are at the content that moves between standards, and there were really just one aspect of it, and that is, great, that is that we moved the description of the process for supervising minor volunteers from 3.7 to 3.6. So it was in screening procedures and is now in volunteer policies. And why is that? That is because, first of all, we noticed from reaccreditation 2017, as I mentioned, learning, that a lot of affiliates actually had it in their volunteer policies. And so it also kind of didn't fit in with the pre-engagement process. It was more about ongoing management of volunteers. And so we just thought that it didn't fit really with screening process, which is pre-employment or pre-engagement, and so we moved it. Now, if you have the description of the process of supervising minor volunteers in screening procedures, that is fine. You do not need to move it for reaccreditation 2018, or even if you're preparing already for reaccreditation 2019. We will find these policies wherever you put them, but for the purposes of making it, I think, a little bit clearer, and again, just reflecting things that we saw anyway with our cohort from reaccreditation 2017, we decided to move it to volunteer policies. So I'm going to stop there for questions. And I also wanted to see if Laura had anything to add about that, any of the things that I talked about, but perhaps that will come out in some of the questions. So does anyone have any questions?
As a reminder here, you can use the chat box to enter your question or raise your hand.
Sure, and a lot of people are kind of thinking through their questions or typing them. one thing I just did want to add to something you said, on the board policies, those policies, like you said, do not have to be in one package. They can be in the bylaws. They can be in other documents that the board uses. The one caveat there is that they are required to be board approved. So if you have those board policies in another document, another place, just make sure that wherever that other place is, whether it's just a series of board documents you give them at orientation, make sure that your board has approved whatever document that is where those other pieces of the policies are housed and that it's recorded in your minutes. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. It's just one of those little caveats. It's in the standard, but just wanted to point that out.
Here we have a question. Bringing it up. Let's see, the board self-assessment section, are you still requiring assessment of board composition and board function? You are just removing the detail of those elements. And I believe...
That's correct.
Yes, that's correct. And we were just removing the specificity of the aspects. I think before it was
very specific to, I think, different
ways to kind of
identify board members, and now we kind of open that up and make it, I think, more that you can tailor it to your affiliate board.
Right. So again, with that one, I would say if that's something you've adopted and you're doing, if that works for you, that framework that was provided previously, that's great. We did just decide it would be helpful to open it up depending on where boards are, what specifics they really want to focus on addressing and assessing at any given moment in time. But if that framework that was previously the standard still works for you, carry on with it. It's still a solid framework for that assessment.
Don't see any hands raised. I'm going to quickly check the chat box again. Any other questions coming in via the chat? I don't see any. We will also have time for questions at the end, so if you have something that comes up between now and then, that would be fun.
Can I just make one other thing that came up in my mind, just in case anyone else out there is thinking this. When we were talking about the financial management and accountability policies, and Julie mentioned that the board signatory piece, or the board approval of account signatories no longer needs to be in those policies. One of the things Julie mentioned is that when an audit is conducted, that's something that's verified. I just want to make it sure it's clear. I know Julie said, affiliates get audited, but the requirement around who needs to have an audit versus who needs a financial review has not changed. So I just want to be clear that not all affiliates will undergo that audit, but that condition, the piece around the signatories, still would be addressed under the general assignment of responsibility, of fiduciary responsibility to the board through the bylaws. So for folks undergoing just a limited review, that's fine. That's where that piece is really captured for you. For folks going through the audit, there are really two layers there that look into whether or not the board is really watching who's getting access to those accounts. So just a minor clarification. I just didn't want anyone perhaps listening to this later either to worry that there were any changes in that requirement.
Yes, and I do often forget about that, and I do apologize for if there was any confusion there. Another question coming in the screening procedures, are you not requiring a written application anymore? A resume is sufficient? And I actually, Laura, is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you restate that question? It just wasn't clear quite.
Yep.
It was the screening procedures.
Are you not requiring a written application anymore? A resume is sufficient?
So those pieces, I'm just scrolling to the revised standard. I want to make sure I give you the most accurate answer. That piece, it's A of the standard, hasn't specifically changed. You can do a written application, resume, or CV. So those pieces under A have not changed. What did change, and the only change here, was really a clarification that we're talking about pre-employment pieces in the screening procedures. So that shall happen pre-employment. And again, that's more just codifying practice. That's what people are doing. But we just want it to be very clear and to help differentiate what's really in the screening procedures versus what goes into the orientation and training pieces. So hopefully that addressed what you were asking.
Thank you. And I don't see any other hands.
So I think we're going to continue on, and we're going to do student support standard tweaks, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Laura, who will go over those aspects of the tweaks.
Sure, and I have to say I got the easy part of this today. So you've already seen, maybe take a deep breath because you've already seen most of the updates. That's really the majority in the business standards. We do have a few in the student support standards, but you'll see it's a much shorter list. So Kelly, if you can move to the first slide for us. Thank you. So we'll start again with the clarifications. The first big clarification or category of clarifications is that we needed to make sure that the student support standards align with language in SYSDEM 2.0. So if you think about the indicators for some of the standards, places like where you enter your school needs assessment, your school support plan, in the past version of standards, it told you where to go in SYSDEM 1.0. So we took all of those references and made sure that they now correspond with the place that you would enter that same information in SYSDEM 2.0. So it should be clear when you're looking at the standard and then have the indicator and line it up next to SYSDEM, if you're doing the entry, where it is that you would go to enter that information that meets that standard. So there are a lot of those little clarifications. They are pretty minor tweaks, but you will notice those differences, and that's really just to align with that language in SYSDEM 2.0. So those are the biggest changes in terms of numbers, just the most that you'll see throughout the standards. We did make a few standard-specific clarifications. So under 1.4, the annual school support plan, we wanted to make sure that it was clear how the annual monitoring piece occurs. So in the past, there was a description more of how progress and improvement should be defined and monitored through the setting of targets in each school area and required report outs. The language focuses now on establishing the targets. So if you have worked with SYSDEM, you'll know there's a place that you can go in for your school-wide goals and you set a target. We are at perhaps this percentage of average daily attendance for our school, and we want to get to this percentage, maybe 90 to 95%, whatever it is. We wanted to make it clear in the language of the standard that by setting those targets, you're helping to meet this part of the standard around defining how progress and improvement will be defined and then how you'll monitor and adjust it. So that'll come through the setting of the targets and then the reporting process. So again, it's really just a clarification and where that information is entered into SYSDEM 2.0 and how it's captured. But because that one's a little more substantial, we wanted to make sure people clearly understood that if you're entering the targets and then you're doing your reporting, you are meeting the requirements around progress and improvement and how they're defined and monitored in your school support plan. So that's one of the big ones. The other piece in the consent form, and this applies to both the consent form for CIS model comprehensive schools and if you provide general use services at general use sites, general use services sites. We wanted to make sure it was very clear that signed consent forms should be secured before collecting any student data in addition to providing any support to the students. So the standard had previously just said you have to get the consent form before you provide actual support to the students, and we wanted to make sure it was clear that it also should occur before you access any data. Again, something you are probably all doing in practice, but we just wanted to make sure it was codified and clear in that standard. Okay, Kelly, next slide, please. All right, so we also removed a little content. If you picture the previous version of standards, under 2.4, which addresses school saturation and those 5% and 10% rates based on school size, there was a little note that said that there might be updates coming to the school saturation rates. We removed that. We think it just causes anxiety and makes people feel a little nervous or what's going to change, and it provides a certain amount of uncertainty that things are going to change. But for the moment, there is ongoing research, and if the research gets to a point where it gives us updated numbers, better numbers to be reaching for there, certainly that will be rolled out over time. But for the moment, we really want people to focus on the current requirements, just focusing on that 5% and 10%, whichever one's appropriate. So that's one of the things that we removed. You just won't see that note anymore. And then the next piece, we removed the list of standard metrics. In the last revision of standards, we'd added an Appendix A to the end of the standards, and it listed through the standard metrics. But we just decided it was easier for us, and probably for you, more importantly, if you can search on the NRC or look up those standard metrics as their own standalone document and separate, instead of having to remember they're buried in the standards at the end as an appendix. So we pulled those out, made them a standalone document you can access on the NRC separately, just to make it, again, easier to find, easier to locate. So those are still out there, they're just in a standalone format now. Okay, next slide, please. And then added content. So, so we added an indicator in 3 different standards, and these are the standards that pertain to the periodic updates that go to school leadership, to the school support team, and to CIS leadership. And we require that that reporting now be documented in SysDem. So each time a site coordinator does that reporting, they'll go into SysDem and make just a quick entry that says, yep, I did this report. It helps us to track, and you as their supervisors and perhaps CQS coordinators to see, are folks doing the reporting that they're required to do? You'd still need to see the separate report, copies of the report, to make sure it contains all the items, the different pieces of content outlined in the standards for each group. But this at least allows you to be able to see, did that reporting occur? Is the site coordinator on top of their reporting? Are they sending out those reports when they're supposed to? And this really just aligns with that new functionality in SysDem that we now are able to capture those reports. So that's one of the pieces that's been added. And then the second piece, for folks who have or provide general use services, so things that are not the CIS model, and maybe some of you on this call do not have them, that's great. If you do, this applies to you. So if you do provide these general use services, we've had a standard for a while pertaining to what data needs to be entered. We wanted to get a little more specific. So we've always required the school and site name, the demographics, and the number of program participants. Those pieces are the same. What's changed is we used to ask for the number of services brokered or delivered. We'd like a little more specificity. So now we're asking for support delivery dates, providers, and duration. So those entries still only need to be made at least annually. That piece has not changed either. But when you do make those entries, you'll be a little more specific on what those supports that were delivered looked like. So that's it for that one. And I think that brings us to our end. So are we going through the next pieces, Julie? Do I understand right? And then we'll pause for questions on the student support standards?
That's correct. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who's going to discuss impact and some information about where you can find some more information on the NRC.
Great. So I know that you are asking, all of you are asking this huge question, how does this impact me? How does this impact me if I went through reaccreditation this last year? How does this impact me if I went through, if I'm going through reaccreditation this year? So to answer that, you should not have been docked for any of these tweaks if you went through reaccreditation 2017. So what we did is we went through, and as Julie said, we used some of those findings from reaccreditation 2017, the things that we learned from that process, to help us understand what changes could be made here. And so you didn't receive any penalizations, you didn't receive any findings for something that would therefore then become a tweak that we've just released. For the folks who are going through reaccreditation this year, these sort of updated standards, these tweaks are active as of today, and so you will be sort of held accountable for these tweaks. So if there are things that content that has been removed, you are not asked to kind of include that in your documentation that you've been asked to upload. If there is content that has been added, you are asked to be held responsible for those pieces. So keep that in mind for if you are going through the reaccreditation process. These changes apply to the entire network, no matter where you sit in that reaccreditation cycle. And it would be really rare for us to assign a finding for anything that is kind of covered in these tweaks. If we were to release anything more significant, that would be done through a much different process, and so it wouldn't come out through these types of tweaks. The other question that I know is burning on your minds is, how do I find these standards? And so, we can help you because we have them here on the NRC. So you can find the updated standards here on the affiliate standards page. Most up-to-date version is going to be there, live, whether you're an independent or a merged affiliate. And then the last two links on that bottom side there, it says summary of updates from January 2018 and archive summary of updates. Those are going to be where you find the document that Julie was talking about that is so helpful in terms of, breaking down sort of each of these slides, the pieces that we removed, the pieces that we've clarified, the pieces that we've added or combined. And so, you can kind of see it there in a handy chart, which you can see in the little pop-out. And then if you were sort of around last year or paying attention last year, you remember one of these slides coming out last year as well when we released other tweaks to the standards in March. Those can be found in that archive summary and updates, and that's where we're going to be committing to storing sort of this version when we come out with any tweaks next year. So, yes, we recognize that in March we released tweaks last year, and this year we released tweaks in January. We anticipate continuing that practice of releasing sort of small clarifying language tweaks every January, and we'll keep them here as a record so that you can keep an idea of sort of up-to-date, what are your most up-to-date standards, and what are the sort of ways that they've changed throughout the years. Again, they'll be in sort of clarifying ways, just sort of removing and adding and clarifying content.
And just to also discuss that if you are a state office or if you are an affiliate that's moving to a state office structure for some reason you're growing, the standard tweaks that we made today would be also reflected in the state standards to their corresponding standards. So that's just something we, of course, are doing both at the same time. It would be silly of us to do one and then not update the state standard, the corresponding state standard. So, of course, it only applies if you are a state standard toward a state standard structure, but just rest assured that it will all be consistent.
Right, and I would just add to that, so state standards, the network operations standards will likely have a few tweaks as well, and you should look for those probably next month. But we'll make sure that that information gets out to you and that it's communicated. But as Julie said, the pieces around business standards and student support standards will be carried through to your standards. One other thing I just wanted to make sure people were aware of is whenever you're looking at the standards, if you go to the second page after the title page, it will give you a revision date and a summary of the description of revisions. So if you ever want to be sure that you're looking at the right version, if you're like me, you probably have multiple versions of standards saved to your desktop or to your files. So just go to that second page and it should clearly state what the revision date was, just so you can be sure that you're always working on the most up-to-date version.
And actually that coincides with the way that we've organized the NRC now, is that when you download the document, it has the date in the document title. So if you were to go and download the document on independent standards, you will notice it says January of 2018, so that you can be assured that that is correct. So now we're going to move over to questions, and I do have a couple already in the queue here. And then, of course, remember you could put in the chat or raise your hand. So the first question here, can you clarify the requirement of the background check procedure, basically 3.7 Part A, or Part D, I should say, versus Standard 3.8 Part C? So Standard 3.7 pertains to the pre-screening. So we expect that you will have background checks as part of your pre-screening. But then background checks is more than just pre-screening. It's kind of its own separate, because of the risk that is associated with background checks, especially because of the students that we serve. We have it as its own standard and its own requirements. And you'll notice that the background check procedure is much more rigorous. So we require it to be repeated every 3 years. You have to have the process of how you're going to obtain it and store it, and et cetera. That's all outlined there in the standard. So I would say that 3.7 is, again, those pre-screening, what you do prior to somebody being employed. Part of that is background checks, but then background checks is its own thing that is continuous throughout the employment of that person. Laura, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good explanation. They are very closely integrated, of course. And if you're looking at the screening procedures, it points to background checks because when you actually look at the background check procedure standard, that's where you also find out who, as part of their screening, might be required to participate in a background check. You can really flesh out some more of the details and what that process looks like there. And we didn't want to make people put in both the screening and the background check procedures. So we wanted to make sure that they pointed together. They were kind of two parts of a whole. How you get people on board, what you need to do to background check them then, plus, as Julie said, what you need to do over time. What are the ongoing background check requirements?
The next question is, will Box.com have the updated standards? So if you're going through reaccreditation 2018, you have a Box.com folder structure that reflects what we would expect folks and affiliates to upload. We do not put these standards in that affiliate structure, but what you might be thinking of are the guides and what is required to be uploaded, and yes, those guides and requirements reflect the tweaks. So if something is no longer required, it will not be in the guide because you don't have to upload it. I see here that I don't know if I see any other questions coming in the chat. However, it looks like someone might have asked a question, but I just don't see it in the chat. So Angela Beavers, I'm going to unmute you. If you have a question, it's telling me that you do. So I'm unmuting you.
It's on the Q&A, actually. So it's hiding in a different box. Yep, that's why I'm, no worries.
Did you find it?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So the question here from Angela is, so all staff must have a background check every 3 years.
And that is correct.
All staff that interact with students and student data.
Yes.
So if you are a staff member that does not access student or student data, that is not the case. But yes, it should be every 3 years.
So I would just add that with student data or any confidential or sensitive data. So if you have, say, a finance manager who is working with sensitive financial information, they would also be required to have a background check, as would, say, an HR manager who's looking at personnel files. So the specific language in Section A of the standard is that there needs to be conducted on all individuals that work on behalf of CIS with students and or any confidential or sensitive data. So that includes student data, but I just want to make sure people think more broadly, too, to what other kinds of confidential and sensitive data might you have staff working with where it would be appropriate for them to have a background check as well.
And ultimately, this is Chris. Folks, sorry, I'm off camera. This is Chris Murray. The one recommendation I would make, though, is that, yes, most, if not all of your staff undergoes at least a background check prior to hire. What we have found is that just from a risk management and youth protection standpoint, while their job description may not identify them as having access to confidential data, student data, or providing direct services to students, access to an organization that does can be a potential risk for any staff member who may come in with a criminal background. And so just appropriate to conduct those checks and decide appropriately as those checks come back whether or not an individual is eligible for hire. And most of our affiliates, I would say, just in general, do provide background checks on all staff. We do it at the national office as well. And so just from a best practice recommendation standpoint, I would say at a minimum prior to hiring, you're conducting background checks on all staff. But yes, the standard only requires it for those who have access to both students and confidential information, be it student level data or organizational data.
I'm not seeing any more questions, but we are happy to just hang on for a moment or two before we wrap up.
All right, so I don't see any other questions. Of course, I encourage you, if you do have questions, my email is right there on the screen. Please reach out. We love to answer questions. As I mentioned, you'll be getting a copy of this recording along with the summary document that I referenced throughout the presentation. And then lastly, I'll also be sending you, if you so choose, we're doing a webinar series this spring on sticky standards and basically open office hours. And so if you want to pop into those, they will be held the fourth Thursday of every month. And I'll include the link to those so you can sign up and hop on, hop off whenever you have a question. Thanks so much for spending your Thursday afternoon, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.